Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Library of Congress National Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know we're going to have an incredible conversation about two incredible books authored by two incredible writers. This session is called Past Pain, Future Hope, Perseverance in Literature with Tomás Q. Morín and Morgan Talty. Tomás is on the faculty at Rice University and Vermont College of Fine Arts. He is the author of 3 poetry collections, and his most recent book is called Let Me Count the Ways, a memoir. Morgan Talty is an assistant professor at the University of Maine. His debut book is called Nights of the Living Rez, a collection of stories. My name is Tope Folarin. I'm a fellow writer. I direct the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a think tank here in DC, and I'm also the Lannan Visiting Lecturer in Creative Writing at Georgetown University. My debut novel is called A Particular Kind of Black Man, and it was published by Simon & Schuster. We all want to give a shout out to the National Endowment for the Arts, which is sponsoring this session, and we all have the great honor of being NEA fellows as well, so we'll have a conversation about that a bit later, but so much love to the NEA for its support of literature across the country, and of course for sponsoring this conversation today as well. I want to remind all of you that we're going to be having a Q&A session sort of at the conclusion of our conversation, so please, as any questions occur to you, keep them in mind so that we can have a kind of robust conversation after I've spoken with both of these wonderful writers. And they both have a signing session at 12:30 p.m., so a few minutes after the conclusion of our conversation today. With that, let's start the conversation. I have to say that it's truly an honor for me to be speaking with both of you. Had the great honor of reading your books over the past few weeks, and I greatly enjoyed them, and I think they're incredibly important books. So, and the thing, there's some logic here in, I think, having us have a conversation because we kind of write about similar themes, so I hope to have an opportunity to discuss that in some depth as we move forward. But I wanted to ask both of you at the outset how both of you found your way to literature. It's a question as a writer that I'm obsessed with, and I constantly think about as I sort of think about my own trajectory as a writer. I suppose in some ways, my pathway to literature is my parents, my father in particular, needed a kind of babysitter, so he dropped me off at the library and said, just look after him while I'm at work. And I, had so much fun reading as many books as I could. So I wanted to ask both of you how literature sort of came to be such an important part of your life. So I wanted to start with you, Tomás.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, everyone, first for coming and listening to us speak for a little bit. My path started actually just down the road in Baltimore. It was back in '98. I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins and in Hispanic and Italian studies, and I had taken some poetry workshops as an undergrad, like a lot of undergrads do. It was a fun elective sort of thing to do, but didn't ever really imagine writing books. And when I was living in Baltimore, I experienced my first major depression, and the only sort of like glimmer of hope in my days was writing and reading poems. So for me, starting at that point, it was an act of survival, really. And then I thought, well, maybe I should pursue this because it brings me so much joy. And then that led to, I left that program, got a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, and and then just kept going forward with it.
Were there any particular books or writers who were helpful to you during that sort of darker period of your life?
The one that always stands out is the poet Philip Levine, who passed away a few years back. And during that time, one of my friends in that graduate program I was in, when I was considering whether to leave the program and try to be a writer, she said, maybe you should write a letter to that Levine guy that you're always reading and talking about. And I thought, nobody does that. She was from Spain. I thought maybe they do that over there. It's not something we do here. We don't write our heroes. Then a couple weeks later, in a really dark moment, I sat down, I wrote him a letter, put it in the mail, and just asked, explained my situation, asked if he would be willing to read a few poems and tell me if he thought there was anything worth pursuing. Immediately regretted it, wanted to get it out of the mailbox, couldn't. 3 weeks later, 3 weeks later, there was a letter from him, and handwritten, and he said something like, over the years, poetry has been really good to me, and the least I can do for poetry is to give you my honesty. So send me 3 poems that you have faith in.
Wow.
And I'll let you know what I think. So super nervous at that point.
That's a moment, right?
That's a moment. That's a moment, yeah. So I sent him 3 poems, and he sent them back with notes on them. He said something like, you have talent, and one of the poems shows that you have a gift that you still don't know how to use. You're not resourceful. But all 3 poems show that you still don't know the first thing about how to make a poem. And I think someone who maybe wasn't an eternal optimist in the way I am would have cued in on that part. But instead, I was like, talent? Gift? I'm like, okay, that's all I needed to know. Like, if all I need to do is work hard, this is the path for me. So I thanked him, and then headed down that path.
That's an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Morgan, how about you? How did you find your way to literature?
Oh, it's a long story. I hated reading and writing growing up. I did not care for it. I was a kid who loved the woods, a kid who loved being outside of school. But I was always surrounded by stories. I grew up on the Penobscot Indian Nation, and the more I think about it, the more I feel like, I've always loved telling stories. I've always loved, when I was with friends in the woods, I would tell stories. I remember being, young in 2nd grade, and during parent-teacher conferences getting, not sort of scolded, but the teacher telling my mom that I was making up stories that just weren't real.
Yeah.
For one, I told her in the summers I worked for a moving company, and when my mom went in there, she's like, well, he does live with his father in the summer, and his father does have a moving company, and so I was kind of mixing, truth and, fact and fiction, and, I had sort of like a very tumultuous high school, just upbringing. I didn't really give my attention to school and to education, and, when I went to college, when I went off to school, things sort of became clearer for me, and I started to read, and I started to realize stories could exist, not in the way that my mom was telling my honest story, which my mother was the best storyteller. She could take a story, I would have seen it, she would have told my aunt, and she would have gotten half of it wrong. Like I think that's where I picked up like my best skills in writing fiction, was knowing when to elaborate, knowing when to say that you weren't the one who started the fight, all that stuff. And I realized that I could do this storytelling in written form, and I just started reading, and I said to myself, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be a storyteller. And I got my undergraduate in Native American Studies, and then I did my MFA at the Stone Coast MFA program. And midway through the Stone Coast MFA program, I was like, it's really hard to be a writer. And I was like, if I had known this earlier, no. But I think my stubbornness and my desire to just tell stories is really what got me to this point. And using fiction and nonfiction as a means to communicate what we tend to forget about humanity, and what we need to be sort of reminded, I think.
I want to ask you the same question I asked Tomás, which is, could you tell me about, or tell us, I should say, about some writers who inspired you, or writers who prompted you to stay on the path of pursuing your desire to become a writer?
Yeah, very early on, I will have to say Jack Kerouac of all the writers. He, I mentioned I would visit my father in the summer, and my mom would very eagerly put me on the Greyhound bus, and I'd ride from Bangor, Maine, down to South Station, and sometimes I'd have a layover overnight there, which was weird. And I was like 12 and I was like 12 outside, I'm like, do you have a cigarette, And, and then I'd get on the bus and go, down to Bridgeport and stay with my dad. And so when I encountered Kerouac, which I was supposed to have read in the 10th grade, which never did. But when I read him in college, I sort of saw this sense of traveling, this sense of, on the road, sort of prevalent in a lot of, what I had done growing up.
Yeah.
And I just loved his voice. I was captivated by his word choice, his diction, his style and everything. And I just tore through the beat writers. And then I found myself entranced by indigenous fiction.
Yeah.
That was sort of my next thing. And,
Yeah.
I think the book that transformed me the most was The Lesser Blessed by Richard Van Camp, who is a Canadian native writer. He's a member of the Dog Rib Nation. Phenomenal book. I think it came out in '91. Great book. Highly recommend. So yeah, those and Louise Erdrich and Joy Harjo and Scott Malmaday.
The greats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wonderful. My strong suspicion is that there are a few aspiring writers out there in the audience. And so I wanted to ask both of you to talk a little bit about the journey to becoming a writer, and how you surmounted the various barriers that we all face as we try to make it as writers. Tomás, you've spoken about this a little bit as you talked about, sort of that optimism you had when you received a letter from your literary hero and taking the good and perhaps not dwelling on the not so good sort of parts of that feedback. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about like the sort of the life of a writer and why it is that you've committed yourself to that path.
Yeah, it's twofold for me. One is I had to, after I left my graduate program, I had to make peace with the fact that there would probably be more no's in the writing life than there would be yeses. More doors would close than would open. I had this 5-year window where I didn't have a single piece picked up by a literary magazine or a journal. And it was this was before submittable, so all the no's were coming in the mailbox.
Snail mail no's, right?
Yeah, snail mail no's. And there was one day where I received 3 rejections. I was simultaneously submitting 3 rejections for the same work on the same day. And the brutal thing is, they're self-addressed stamped envelopes, right? So it's your own handwriting that's coming back to you. In a way, I feel like submittable is a little more kind in that sense.
Sure.
And that was the moment where I thought, that was in the middle of the 5 years where I thought, can I keep doing this? Why would I keep doing this if these moments feel so awful? And my answer was a very quick yes, but I had to make the contract with myself that in the understanding that writing and publishing are different things. They require different kinds of energies, different skill sets, and if I keep those worlds separate, and if I never publish again, then the joy that I get from creating work will be preserved and will be for me, and that's something that I can take into the rest of my life. And it's not dependent upon a yes or a no from an editor that I don't know. And then eventually things started getting picked up. But I think looking back, a lot of those no's were very justified. The work wasn't where it needed to be.
Yeah.
It wasn't good enough. So that was really important at coming to this understanding that writing wasn't going to just be a profession for me, it was going to be a life.
Yeah.
Just like the person who commits themselves to doing Tai Chi every day because it cleanses their spirit and it feels good and it's a way of being in the world. For me, the writing process is the exact same thing. I write in the same way for the same reason that I eat, the same reason that I drink, same reason that I exercise. It's just a part of my life.
It's a beautiful response. Thank you so much for that. Morgan, I wanted to ask you the same question. Why have you committed yourself to this lifestyle?
I don't know what else to do with myself. I've always felt, I described this to somebody once. It was almost like I feel dirty if I don't write. Like I feel like writing is somehow a way of like cleaning.
Yeah.
And I think writing in its very basic, generative sense is a knowledge-making activity.
Sure.
And, for me, I've always found, like what you said, separating the business side of writing with the art of writing, a really critical thing to think about, because you won't get anything, at least for me, I always just wrote because I wanted to write, and I remember eventually I was like, I'm going to start sending stuff out, and you buy the writer's marketplace book, whatever.
Yep, been there.
You're like, which one of these has 5 money symbols? Through and
Exactly.
and I remember sending stuff out, and everybody saying, no, and I think I didn't get my first acceptance, I think, until 8 or 9 years of writing and actually submitting.
Yeah.
And I actually never even saw the journal it was in, because it was such a small, obscure place. And then I also paid $20 for 2 more copies that I never got. So I don't know if this really counts. But yeah, I think it's, for me, it's, I write because it's the only thing I feel like I have an obligation to do so. I have an obligation to try to articulate something about the human condition that we're all trying to articulate and understand in a way that moves us past the hardships of living, the hard realities that, we use stories as a way to cope with, what we don't know, right?
Yeah,
right.
The very basic essentials, like where did we come from, what is going on? And so I think it's been a form of distraction for me, but it's also been a form of discovery. And there's no greater pleasure I get than working on a story and coming to a moment where I am like, oh my God. Like for me, I think of story as being this entity that exists and will exist regardless of whether we're here or not. Story is always happening. And I try to listen to it. And, for the writers out there who are writing and, may experience some sense of struggle with a story or a poem, consider that perhaps that resistance isn't necessarily consider that resistance is the story telling you it wants to go a different direction, right?
Yeah.
So it's talking to you, it's communicating to you. And I find that to be almost sort of, magical in a sense.
Yeah. No, you're so right. And I love the fact that both of you kind of mentioned what I think is the kind of the intrinsically spiritual practice of writing. And it's the one thing that I was most sort of surprised with when I started writing was exactly what you described, Morgan. That sense when you're at your desk on your laptop, or you're writing longhand, or however it is you produce work, when you sense the story responding to you in a way. It's truly a kind of magical thing. I remember when I started writing, I would go on YouTube and I would listen to my favorite writers talk about like the craft of writing. I'd listen to them talk about how it is they sort of were able to start their careers. And almost all of them would inevitably say at some point that their character spoke to them. And I thought, this is a bunch of mumbo jumbo. What I need is craft lessons. What I need are the secrets of the trade. I don't want to hear the nonsense about, like how the character told you to do something or something. But I discovered when I started, I committed myself to the practice of writing, that for me it wasn't characters, but it was a story. The story would say, this is not the right direction, and I will not yield to your desire to force me in this direction. I want to go in that direction. And learning to kind of listen to that was, I think, key to my sort of discovering how I wanted to be a writer in the world, and how my story is more important than that wanted to be as well. So I love the way that both of you discussed that. Morgan, I wanted to talk a little bit about your collection. I loved it. I had the great pleasure of reading it over the past few days and sharing passages with my partner and my kids, and so we really enjoyed the collection. I especially loved the character David, who is kind of like a central figure in your collection, and his voice and perspective kind of links the stories. I wanted to read a bit of what the New York Times has to say about your collection. They say, Talty has an incredible ability to take the seemingly disparate events of David's life and reveal how interconnected they are, how each tiny decision becomes something bigger, how the small moments click together in ways that are both heartbreaking and revelatory. Could you discuss how you developed David and how he became the kind of sort of central figure in your book? and how you determined that he would play such an important role in your book as well.
Yeah, so I think, when I first started writing, I think like most writers tend to gravitate toward, themselves, projecting themselves. And so David, I think, was in many ways very early on, iterations of him and stories that were not in the book, sort of images of me in a sense. And when I began to realize fiction, I could leave that autobiographical part, or a majority of it. He became this boy who I just cared for very deeply. The way he observed the world, the way he cared for his mother, the way he cared for his sister, the way he cared for everybody who would fail him at some point in his life. And so I just kept writing stories with him. And I said I was going to write a collection of stories told from David's point of view, starting with him being a boy all the way until he was a young adult. And so I wrote about 15 or 16 stories all told from David's point of view. And I looked at the book and, I'm all feeling good. And then I read it and I'm like, this sucks. And it was so bad. It was, it was just different stories and situations with the same character. There was nothing, it didn't work. And so I set it aside and I went and wrote this other story called Burn, which features a character. When I was drafting the story, it's about a guy, Fellas, who gets his hair frozen in the snow, and his friend finds him, and he has to cut his braid. And I kept wanting to call the character David, because I was writing in first person. I had been writing so long, and I was like, it's not David, I'm leaving that project. And I just put the letter D in as a placeholder. Yeah. And as I was revising, I was like, what is this person's name? And then I put 2 E's at the end, and I was like, oh, he goes by the name D. And I was like, wait, is this David all grown up? And eventually my collection came back to life. And I was like, okay, what happened now? And so I found David as a boy, and then I found him later by accident as an adult who had completely turned himself around and was not this child anymore. He was very troubled. And I was just so, he's still sort of the same when you read him as an adult as he was a child, except He's troubled. And, I think finding David was purely accidental. I think, it was a sustained effort of writing, really, and investing my time and, commitment into this individual, and trying to look at him from various angles. I think for any writer out there, it's like, there's 12 stories in here, but there's probably 40 or 50 that are in a folder somewhere that didn't work,
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. How did you settle on the short story as the best kind of form for telling these tales?
I think I got to a point where I was too far deep to turn around. I had written, and published some in venues and stuff, and I was like, I'm gonna just have this be a story collection, but I also kind of want it to read like a novel. And the book has a very, I wouldn't say an overarching arc, I would rather say it's buried underground, and it's connecting the book very emotionally. Yeah. And I recognize that, again, listening to the story and, seeing what it will allow you the opportunity to do. And so I did do that. I kept with the story structure, and I tried to find moments where I wouldn't implicate the stories in a whole narrative, but rather suggest their existence as they exist, or as they coexist. In one story, D hurts his leg, and then in a later, due to a car accident, and in a later story, for example, someone asks him to drive, and he goes, I hate driving, and he scratches his leg. And it was like trying to find these little details that linked the stories, but not directly in your face. And I had agents and being like, I can't sell this because it's a story collection. And they're like, can you turn it into a novel? Yeah. I can try. And I tried, and the more I did, the more the stories began to break. The more pressure I applied, and I eventually got to the point where I said, whatever, if you can't, leave me alone. If it doesn't get published, it doesn't get published. But I stayed true to what I thought that the form should have been, which was this story novel structure, and you're holding the book now. So.
Yeah, yeah. It works. Yeah. It works. It works really well. Tomás, I wanted to ask you a bit about your book. Now, I have to say that I know you as a poet. That's how I have engaged with your work in the past. And so I was surprised when I saw your name on the NEA list of fellows as a prose winner. And
I was too.
yeah, I was really taken back by that. And I thought, wow, I was like, this is the same dude that I've been reading his poetry for a while. So I was wondering if you could talk about the decision to pivot to prose after a career spent writing and publishing poetry.
Yeah, it's funny. In the first two books of poetry that I published, most of the poems are written through either dramatic monologues, or written through personas, through masks. And I made that decision early on because I thought, who would ever want to read anything about my life? My life is so boring. It's like it's not the stuff of of literature. So I was always writing through behind this mask. It was my life, but always once or twice removed. So then to pivot to prose memoir, what had happened was I was telling these stories about my father figures, about growing up in South Texas. I'd been telling them with close friends for years, and there came a moment where I retold a story to a friend, and I had, it wasn't that I misremembered it, but I told it differently enough that the friend noticed and said, well, I thought first time you told me that story, this was different. And I thought, oh yeah, that's right. And I realized that I had hit this point where the memories were really changing with me and growing as I was changing and growing as a person. And the people that I wrote about were no longer with me or in my life anymore. And so the stories had always, they'd sort of functioned as a way to preserve them, right? To preserve these people. And
Yeah.
I thought if I can put them down in prose, then maybe what will happen is there's this thing that Annie Dillard said once. It was a word of caution for people who write nonfiction, personal nonfiction, that sometimes when you put a story from your life down on paper, it fossilizes it and it stops changing with you. Mm-hmm. So
true.
It fossilizes it, and then you keep growing, but that past event is now frozen because you've used language to freeze it. And that was what I hoped would happen, but in the sense also I wanted to make my father, my surrogate father, my grandfather, like their speech, the rhythms of their bodies, I wanted to make them live, on the page, in the way that my younger self remembered them.
Yeah.
So it was partly an act of preservation, and I didn't know if I could do it. And it was just trying to, the muse gives you homework, and, you do your best to, to complete the assignment.
Yeah. Thank you for that. As a fellow Texan, I was drawn to the evocative ways that you describe Texas in your memoir. You write about Texas with such unflinching honesty and a sense of intimacy as well. Could you describe how your childhood in Texas specifically shaped you and how your relationship to Texas shaped your memoir as well?
Yeah, such a great question. I grew up in a town that was, I think it probably still is, probably 90% Latinx. But yet at the same time I felt invisible. I always felt like I was on the outside, and Texas is, ask any Texan, right? It's big. It's large, it's vast, but at the same time that vastness, it can feel empty.
Yeah.
It can feel empty. And that emptiness, and trying to find a way to live within that emptiness and survive it and thrive in it, was sort of the project of my childhood. Which then, as a writer, my task was to try to, okay, so how can I recreate that, that struggle? But yeah, Texas is, we were talking yesterday, it's such a weird place.
Yeah.
It's such a weird place, and it's like 3 or 4 states all in one. Geographically, it's incredibly different, and so in particular the small town where I grew up in, so 90% Latinx, but yet in my memory, all the doctors, the store owners, police chief, all of the mayor, the city leaders, they were all white. So all of the sort of positions of power, many of the teachers that I remember from my childhood, I was shocked when I found out what the percentage was. Because I thought we were like in the minority. Because in all these positions of power and authority, all I saw were faces that didn't look like mine.
Yeah.
So it was, what part of Texas are you from? It's a weird
North Texas, so places like Carrollton, Arlington, places that are close to Dallas and Fort Worth. So a different Texas than the Texas you grew up in. Yeah, and you're right. Like I've been to South Texas, and I'm like, where am I? It just feels like a completely different place. So yeah. Morgan, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with Maine as well. I have a connection to Maine. Also, I spent a year at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, and met my wife there. And so it's a very special place for us. It's a very cold place as well for many parts of large parts of the year. But I also, when I was in Maine, started reading the work of Carolyn Chu, the great sort of working class. She writes about white working class folks in Maine in really compelling ways. And when I read her work, for me, it was the first time that I started to think that it would be possible for me to render my reality on the page, because it was obvious that she was doing this. And one of the great moments of my time in Maine was when she came to visit our English class and talked in depth about her process and her work and everything else. So I wanted to ask you too about how Maine, as a geographical location, has impacted and influenced your work.
Yeah, so I grew up on the Penobscot Indian Nation, which is in the Bangor area, but it's an island that is in the middle of the Penobscot River, and so you have to take the bridge to go to get onto the reservation. And so I grew up there, and it kind of felt like one big giant house in a sense. You had, everyone was related to each other in some way, right? There goes the cliche in native fiction, everybody's your cousin. But I think that tight-knit community, knowing everybody, somehow everybody knew what you had done before you'd done it, like that type of setting. It just, and I think also a lot of the systemic issues that were in that place, drug and alcohol addiction and mental illness and chronic diseases, caused by federal government rations throughout the years. I think all of that has influenced my writing in a way that is inescapable, and I think to not address those types of things would be sort of an injustice in a way. So it's the people of that place that have really sort of given me the courage, and I think the content to write about, but it's also the place too. I think, it's funny how we were just talking about language, once you use language, you freeze something, right? And, I think, for Penobscot people, it's, place is just an extremely important idea. In the Penobscot language, there's Punawupskek, which is, I'm going to poorly translate it because I can never get it right, but like where the water descends upon the rocks.
Sure.
And if you were to say a Penobscot person, you would take that word and change the suffix. So it would say, instead of Punawupskek, it would be Punawupskewi, one word. So a person who is a part of this place. And that's completely different than English language, right? Like in Penobscot, that's one word, it's connected. Whereas in English, it's, I am from Maine. Everything is separated. So there's this sense of actual physical relationship to that place. And so, in my book, I treat place very much like a character.
Yeah.
It's a way that my characters are able to make sense of themselves, make sense of their ancestors, my ancestors, and I also think too, speaking outside of this indigenous community, there is also that sort of Mainer attitude to the book. Somebody asked me once, they're like, would you describe this as a Mainer book? And I was like, in a way, yeah, because it's, the river, the woods, all of this stuff, it's just, and...
I can never get the accent right. It's Maine, or is it?
Yeah, my father-in-law has a really thick northern Maine accent, and I won't even try to do it, but it's, I think that community, that place has just been central. I can't imagine writing anywhere else, writing about anywhere else, and with my fiction.
Sure. So we are all here as recent recipients of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, and I have to say that so speaking personally, it's been like an incredible honor for me. I longed kind of. Every couple years when the list of prose sort of fellowship winners is announced, I'd peruse the list and I'd see my favorite writers on that list. And for me, getting that fellowship is kind of a marker that I have arrived in a way. And it kind of, it's so meaningful that the government has said in a way, like we notice the work you're doing, we think it's worthy of sort of love and perhaps more important than that, of money, and here you go. Here's a significant sum of money to continue your work. I wanted to ask both of you how, sort of your impressions of the fellowship, perhaps before you got it, and how getting that fellowship has impacted your life and your trajectory as an artist. Start with you, Tomás.
Yeah, I'd applied for the NEA fellowship in poetry for about 10, 12 years or so. Never received it. And near the tail end of that, I started writing some essays and publishing some essays. I'd applied for the NEA fellowship in prose once before I was awarded the fellowship, and because I had published enough to meet the requirements, and I almost didn't apply the second time because I thought, well, they already said no once. I mean, I've, been publishing poetry. Maybe I'm just moonlighting. Maybe I'm just moonlighting. It doesn't feel like it, but it feels like that's the message I'm getting. And I think it was the week the application was due. I thought, well, the odds of winning this are better than winning the lottery. So it's not really costing me anything to apply again. So I went ahead and sent my application in, and then forgot about it. Completely forgot about it. So for me, being chosen felt like, okay, like I'm someone sees me as a prose writer who is, worthy enough to be in the company of folks like the two of you, Laura Vandenberg, Melissa Febos, and these other prose writers that I admire. And I thought, okay, like I'm not a moonlighter anymore. This is, I'm doing the thing. I belong. I feel like I belong in this group, and can't just call myself a poet who also writes XYZ anymore. I'm a writer. I'm a writer now. So.
How about getting that call from Amy Stoles, who's the literary director of the NEA? What was that experience like?
Yeah,
who's here, I believe, as well. Shout out to Amy.
Amy's right there. I was in Terminal C of the Houston airport, of the Bush airport, and whenever I happened to pass by the Thai place that was right where I was when I received the call, like I always remember that, and I always take it as a good omen. So on the way over here, I was supposed to fly out of Terminal E. Flight got canceled, and then they said, okay, new plane, Terminal C. So I hustled over there and I walked right by the spot.
Oh, that's great.
Where I'd received the call, and I thought, okay, this is going to be a good flight. It's going to be smooth, which it was. But yeah, it was just, it was an incredible moment.
Yeah. Morgan, how about you? Your experience with the NEA fellowship?
Yeah, I mean, I knew immediately I was going to get one. So I'm in the same with Tomás, that I, used to always see the list of people who would be awarded, the funding, and I remember, I think it was maybe in 2018 maybe that I looked finally at like the criteria, which I think it was like 5 stories published in like 3 different magazines, and I wasn't there yet, and then I did get there eventually, and I was like, I'm gonna apply. I'm like, why not apply? And I got extremely lucky. I applied once and got it. Sorry for that. What did you say? It was like 49 attempts.
Yes, yeah.
But it was just, it felt like I didn't believe, Amy had called me, and I was an adjunct, you know, and I'm sitting in my office with my other adjunct friend, and we were complaining about money, and then I get this call, and I didn't believe it was real, I think. I was like, I don't know who you are, what you want, and then the mention of the NEA, and I'm like, 25,000? So it was, you know, it just felt, it felt very validating in a way to be part of a long line of people who have received this type of funding to support work and who have gone on to produce work that has become influential and unforgettable, and part of a canon of writing that will forever exist. And I'm just, you know, extremely grateful to be part of that lineage, and continue to see others, you know, get it, and
Cool. Thank you so much. I wanted to pause for just a moment and ask if any of you have any questions right now. Anything comes to mind? Any and all questions are acceptable. Yes, please feel free to approach the microphone.
So I just want to ask, I haven't heard a thing about an agent. Should you go that route, or should you just keep sending things off and keeping your fingers crossed?
There are many different roads, you know, to get to, or your work to where you want it to go. I have an agent now. The agent I had before, things ended up not working out, and I sold the memoir myself to the University of Nebraska Press. So there are some presses where, you know, you don't need an agent. You can just send things over the transom. Doing your homework, you know, and figuring out what the different avenues are and what you need to, in order to have access to them, I think is it's really important.
Thank you.
And I think to go on that, if, you know, I'm coming at this from a fiction point of view, you know, if you're a fiction writer, I think, and if you want to publish a novel or a story collection with a major press, you're going to need an agent to get in there. But you can publish without an agent, you know, as you did. There are contests out there too. They're all leaving me right now. Where, you know, you can submit a manuscript, and, you know, I think, is it the Iowa?
Iowa, yeah.
Iowa has the contest. They publish the book. But agents can be really helpful, or they can just be not helpful at all. You know, I had an agent who just didn't do anything for me for a year. The agent I have now feels like an older sister. And so it's like, you can get, the biggest advice is if you don't feel like you're getting, the agent works for you, remember that, okay? And if you get an agent and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, just be like, bye, and then try to find somebody else. But I think for fiction, do your research, look in the back of your favorite books in the acknowledgement sections to see who your favorite writers have thanked for having a specific agent, and add them to the list of people you might want to reach out to.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The one thing I would add to that is that I think it's incredibly important to ensure that your work is solid before. I think we all teach, and so we get these questions a lot about agents and such. And one thing I sometimes see is that folks want to start the process of looking for an agent before their work is as solid as it needs to be. So if you're really sort of secure in the work and you know that it's polished and other folks have read it and like it a lot, then I think you can start the process. But And also agents it's about what you want to do. If you want to sort of, as Morgan said, publish with a big press and the rest of it, like that is a key part of it. But know that you're entering a process that is difficult and has its own issues, and you have to keep the faith. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Please.
I wonder how you've gauged your growth as writers, particularly in the absence of reaching that point where you've been published.
For me, a key thing was the, I don't know if you know that Ira Glass. It's a really short piece on, it's like a paragraph long on taste. If you just Google Ira Glass taste, right, it'll come up, tons of images of it. But he says something in there that he wishes he had known when he started out, which I wish I had known when I started out, which was that in the beginning, one of the things that brings you to writing is your taste as a reader. You have impeccable taste. And that's also the reason why your work often feels like it falls short. And the only way to overcome that hump is to keep writing more and more and more. Because the more you practice it, the more you do it, the more your skill will increase. And hopefully what will happen is that gap between your taste and your skill will start decreasing slowly. So there came a point where I would read my stuff and I would not feel absolutely just disgusted by it, by how it wasn't as good as writer X, Y, or Z, where I would think like, oh, okay, that's pretty good. And then eventually I'd get to a place where like, okay, this is better than anything I've ever done before. So those were really important milestones for me.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the same that you had just said, Tomas. I think I am when it comes to my own work, I'm just never really satisfied with it. One thing one of my first mentors, the writer Rick Bass, said to me, he was like, you need to learn when to stop overworking the story, because I would become so, like I felt like it could be better, but I would work it so hard that I would run it into the ground. And so for me, I had to learn a lot about sort of patience, and so many writers talk about time as being, their worst enemy, but it's also paradoxically our best friend. And learning to set things aside and move on to something else and go back, back and forth, find this balance, this rhythm. I think through doing that, that practice of writing, that practice of engaging in a story, leaving it, doing something else, going back, revising, and however your process is, doing that over a series of years and years and years, you get to a point when you start to sort of understand how you work. But I always caution people to never feel settled, because the moment you feel settled is the moment you have stopped, I think, trying to progress. Like every time I approach a new project, I pretend I'm just a new writer again. I think that's just so important, because each book is so different and has its own logic that we have to figure out. But by that point in time, we have the skills, the craft skills necessary to sort of communicate with it in a way to produce the text. But it's a combination of reading nonstop and writing nonstop.
Yeah. An interviewer once asked Philip Levine, how do you know when a poem is done? And he said, when I've stopped making it worse. Which
it's perfect advice.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think both of your work has been published in Poets and Writers, and I was wondering how literary magazines like Poets and Writers and others go into the mix for you and each of your work.
For me, like Poets and Writers, along with like the Writers Marketplace that you mentioned earlier, it's always been a way to keep up with what's going on in the community, what's new, I love the different features in the magazine, and as I've been in this now since 2000, right? Been working as a writer. So now I've gotten to a place where sometimes my friends are on the cover, you know, and their pieces are in there. So now it's a way to keep up with what the people I know and I respect, and even the people that I admire from a distance, you know, what they're up to. So yeah, that's how it's been important to me.
Yeah, I think for me, literary magazines have been this like, they've been closer to art in a way,
Yeah.
I think, than, I'm not trying to badmouth big publishing or anything, but, you know, I think, you know, looking at literary magazines and journals, you know, they're usually underpaid or not paid at all, and they're doing this out of love for literature. And so what you're getting is really, I think, strong work that you won't usually see in the mainstream. And I just say subscribe to all of them. And, you know, you'll be like Harry Potter when those letters are coming. You know, you'll just, especially if you subscribe to the New Yorker.
Yeah.
That one will come nonstop. Don't forget to turn auto renew off if you get a deal. But yeah, they are central and my first love, and yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Gabrielle. My question is for Tomás. I'm really excited about reading your memoir. I haven't read it yet, but I've read about it. I actually grew up with a father who's bipolar. And he had a lot of manic episodes. So I actually developed OCD as a kid as well to deal with my changing constant environment. So I was really inspired that you decided to write about it. And I was wondering if there was a point in your process, did you struggle at all with sharing your story? Did you know, one thing about COVID was it was so great about bringing about the awareness of mental illness in our society. And I'm just wondering, like, did you struggle with any shame about telling your story? Or, you know, was there a pivotal moment where you were like, you know what, forget that, I really want to just share this? Or was it kind of just a long process?
Great question, and thank you for sharing your struggles with it. I can't answer the question without saying how important therapy and talking about my mental illness has been, like those sessions with my therapist, and just having the language to think about it and to have it be normalized, you know. Like I can't underestimate or overestimate how important that's been. So by the time I got to writing the memoir, I felt like I had the tools necessary to write about the presentation of that illness, and then how it's, you know, developed over my life, and how I still struggle with it in an honest way, in a way that I hope comes across as different than mental illnesses often, or the addiction that my father figures had. That's different than the way they're usually portrayed in other literary works, where you know, someone, you can tell right off the bat if a character's addiction or a character's mental illness is a way to increase the dramatic tension. You know, I wanted to write something where mental illness and addiction were not literary devices in order to tell a good story, but they were part of the story of who these people were and are. You know, and I felt I wasn't seeing enough of that. So I thought, well, let me see what I can do in my own, you know, small way, you know, to try to put that on a page.
Thank you for that question. I think we have about 5 minutes left. There's so much more I want to ask both of you, but time is running short, so I'll settle on this. Tomás, and shout out, by the way, for the Guggenheim. I know you just recently got a Guggenheim as well. Congratulations to you for that. I was reading an interview you recently gave to Texas Monthly, and I was really struck by something you said at the end of that interview. You said, for 3 books now, I've been exploring suffering and trauma and how we survive that. I feel like I'm ready to explore how we thrive when we are in a state of crisis, not just survive anymore. So I wanted to ask both of you, as we are inhabiting a kind of state of crisis.
Yeah.
You know, there's all kind of crises that we're grappling with as a society now, whether it's the climate crisis, democracy seems to be not as strong as it was before. And I wanted to ask both of you as artists how we can get to a place where we sort of create stories that teach us as artists and our audiences how to survive and even thrive during these difficult times. So I'll start with you, Morgan.
Yeah, I think my answer kind of goes back to what you were saying about, not wanting to put addiction or mental illness, as the literary device. And I think the same is true about crisis itself. It's not about it's not about the crisis, I think, but it's about the people who are experiencing it. And, I feel like the term that's used is like misery porn. Like there's so much like literature out there that takes its emotional journey through manipulating the reader to feel a certain way because of a mental illness or something,
Right.
or a specific type of trauma. And, I think, we need to tell stories, because we are in a state of crisis. We have to think about how we tell these stories, how we position them, how we choose to look at it. And for me, I think the best fiction, or the fiction I hope to see and the fiction I hope to write, is the fiction that really doesn't comes from the inside of the character outward, as opposed to looking at the character and moving inward.
Yeah.
I think it's about trying to articulate more than the afflictions and the crises that are occurring, and trying to figure out how these characters live with it, how they put up with it, how they sort of try to transcend it, how they try to heal through it, and maybe even trying to figure out a way out of that crisis, right? Not for, again, to make money, but for actually trying to bring about change in a sense.
Yeah, it's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much. And Tomás?
I think for me, I feel like crisis, it makes you feel like you're in a bubble. So I feel like I've done a really good job so far of writing and exploring inside that bubble, but I want to write about characters and people who are in the bubble, within the bubble, but then also write what's outside the bubble, and make room on the page for that space, that space, which, and I feel, this is just my instinct, I don't know, but I feel like hope is somewhere outside that bubble, and so that's sort of my project, hope and survival are outside that bubble, finding a way to pierce it, getting the person to look up from their grief or their rage and remember that, like I'm also a living, breathing creature, in this world.
How do you do that?
As honestly as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, as honestly as possible.
I think we should end there. It's a wonderful sentiment to end on. I can't even begin to express how wonderful it's been to be in conversation with both of you. Please buy their books. They will be signing books again at 12:30. Such a pleasure to be on the stage with both of you. And thank all of you so much for coming to this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's incredible.